All right, well, welcome everyone. It looks like we've got a good turnout today, according to my screen. So thank you all for coming. This is part of our the Books That Bring Us Together seminar series, which is hosted by the Inheriting the Family AHRC networking project. I think looking around, most of you have been to one of our events before, but in case you haven't, we are interested in how people pass down objects within families and why they do that, how they feel about their objects, what difference it makes, and we're especially interested in emotions and how emotions might help us understand those processes. Our seminar series, of which this is the second one, is meant to kind of offer some kind of small and short, snappy papers that allow us to have interesting and exciting thoughts, and then really great discussion. So the way that we run these sessions is that we just run all of our papers together, and then we all come together for a group discussion. And we want this to be a welcoming and embracing kind of environment. So please feel free to speak and have an opinion, and to kind of make this a real conversation, but also to be respectful and to try and kind of create this as a sort of happy environment. So I think we have our order today on the email, I guess it is, and it's Katie, then John, then Alison, who I think just came in, and Lucy. So I think we'll just go in that order if everyone is happy with that, if you're all happy. As we mentioned, today's theme is family archives, emotional and physical displacement, and all of these papers have a little bit of thinking around the objects that aren't necessarily quite in the right place, or perhaps interesting or surprising in some ways. So we'll start with Katie. Her paper is Preservation Through Separation, the 18th Century Paper Traces of Mary and Charlotte Wynne. And Katie is a third-year PhD student at the University of York in 18th Century Studies. And her PhD is undertaken in collaboration with the National Trust and explores women's paper traces in the 18th century country house, which sounds quite fabulous. But over to you, Katie.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen and hope that it works. It says that I'm not allowed to share my screen.
I don't know how to do that. Do you know how to do that, Joanne? Give permission.
Yes, I think could you try again, Katie? Because I think I should have done that.
Yeah, it's working.
Okay.
Okay.
Great.
Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So yeah, thank you for the introduction, and thank you both for having me. So Mary and Charlotte Wynne were the unmarried sisters of the 5th Baronet of Nostell Priory, whose name is Roland Wynne. Nostell, shown here on the right-hand side, is a country house in Wakefield, West Yorkshire, now owned by the National Trust. Upon their brother's inheritance of the estate, who is depicted here on the left, in 1765, the sisters were banished from their parental home, forced to live without a fixed address, and relied on a measly and unreliable annuity. There is very little trace of Mary and Charlotte in the house today, despite their having an active role in its management and maintenance under their father, the 4th Baronet. But the sisters' paper traces do appear in the Nostell archive. Mary's and Charlotte's letters are just a small amount of the mountain of papers that remain in the archive, but nonetheless important to understanding the wider dynamics of the country house family and how such archives are formed, stored, and inherited. As Kerry Bristol has demonstrated, marginalising sisters and aunts by omitting them from their family tree distorts the context in which country houses were built, estates were run, and future marriages were made. What becomes clear in the context of Mary and Charlotte's letters is that with geographical distance from their family came emotional distance. They write constant pleas about unreceived letters, regret at not being allowed to see their niece and nephew, and most commonly chase the payment of their annuity. Paradoxically though, the Baronet's efforts to distance his sisters from their ancestral home is what has ensured the survival of their letters. What I'd like to draw attention to in this paper is the precarious nature of women's archival traces and how the survival of their voices is often down to chance. While not books per se, Mary and Charlotte's papers demonstrate the uncertain status of letters during the 18th century and how the materiality of such documents could be fundamental to their permanence. As such, by exploring Rowland's additions to Mary's and Charlotte's letters, I hope to draw attention to the ad hoc and unpredictable ways in which female voices survive within the wider hierarchy of estate papers. Ultimately, in treating his relations with a degree of distance, the baronet elevated the status of Mary's and Charlotte's papers above that of a letter. Their writings were instead kept, stored, and inherited as important account-like documents. So common on about a third of the sisters' letters is an annotation in Rowland's hand, appearing at either the top of the page or on the envelope. You can see a couple of examples here. These are brief and often take the form of reminders, such as Miss M. Wynn's letters from London, August 30th, 1766, or, quote, answered this letter on the 20th of October, 1770. Formulaic and devoid of emotion, these labels provide an insight into the pragmatic and administrative way that Rowland negotiated his epistolary relationship with his sisters. But these labels don't just appear in Rowland's hand. A letter from Charlotte in 1782, for example, was labelled answered by T. Taylor, 28th of March, 1782. The T. Taylor referred to here is the baronet's steward, hired to monitor the administrative running of the estate, such as tenancies and leases. In this instance, Charlotte's letter laments her not receiving replies from her brother, despite sending at least 4 in the post. That this one was answered by Rowland's agent can only have increased her distance. And in her next reply, Charlotte makes this very point. Dear brother, by a letter I received from your steward, Mr. Thomas Taylor, dated the 28th of March, last past, he informed me by your orders that you had been so poor in a state of health and so much afflicted with the gout all the winter that you had seldom been able to make use of a pen or do any business, which he said was the case at the time he wrote. That Charlotte notes Rowland's reply was directly from Taylor. She uses the phrase, he informed me by your orders, and not just in his hand, demonstrates that Rowland was not simply using his steward as a scribe, but to actually read and reply to his sister's correspondence. Given that stewards were hired to deal with the business-like aspect of running the country house, it seems that Mary and Charlotte were treated with a level of familial displacement. 18th century letters were valued as physical extensions of the sender, not their agent. Taylor's reading and replying to the sisters' letters suggests that Rowland saw them as a professional rather than domestic correspondence. This is further bolstered by instances where Rowland's labelling is more detailed. On a letter dated the 30th of December, 1766, Rowland added the note on the envelope. My sister Mary Wynn's letter from London, the 30th of December, 1766, with my answer from Nostell, January the 11th, 1767, and Ned's receipt for £100, which I have delivered to my sister Mary Wynn. In this case, Rowland's extra detailed label signifies that this letter contributes to his account keeping. He uses the page to briefly log the comings and goings of his money. Equally, a letter from Charlotte on the 17th of October, 1775 displayed a similar engagement. He adds, November the 21st, 1775, answered and at the same time sent a draft for the value of £48, 5p. Through these additions, Mary's and Charlotte's letters come to resemble the more transactional papers in the Nostell archive, rather than the familiar ones. They pay more material resemblance to letters from Thomas Chippendale or Robert Adam than those between Rowland and his wife Sabine. In framing his epistolary relationship with his sisters as a business-like exchange, Rowland's engagement demonstrates how Mary and Charlotte were still legally tied to the house, but emotionally displaced. So what I've tried to draw attention to so far is that Rowland's engagement with his sister's letters is telling of their displacement from the family home. But the fact that these papers remain is indicative of the longevity of such documents. The transactional-like nature of Rowland's labelling suggests that the letters were filed away. Contrary to the affectionate and emotional power that letters from loved ones held in this period, Rowland's labelling suggests emotional distance. The very practice of labelling these letters, though, attest to engagement beyond the point of reception. Further to this, some letters are even labelled more than once. For example, on a letter from Mary dated September the 19th, 1769, Rowland added the inscription at the top of the first page, answered this letter October the 6th, 1769. But on the envelope, he also added Miss Mary Wynn's letter from London, the 19th of September, answered October the 6th, 1769. That these labels appear on different pages of the letter and provide different information is telling of how Rowland stored these papers. It seems that the baronet added the first label upon replying to his sister's letter, while the second was added as a point of reference once it was filed away. That the second appears on the envelope suggests that, for ease of reference, Rowland filed his sister's letters as closed documents, denoted by a label rather than their content, and not to be easily read again. While these labels demonstrate an objective approach to his sister's letters, it has ensured their survival. And although they were not kept as emotional objects, Mary's and Charlotte's letters were still saved. In 1776, the 5th Baronet commissioned Robert Adam to create, quote, a room for keeping the family writings, and the bespoke bookcases are extant in the house today. These alterations, alongside the fact that Mary and Charlotte were accustomed to receiving letters written by their brother's steward, who it is likely would have worked in the muniments room, suggest that the sisters' letters were stored in this space. In this context, it is possible to find women's paper traces within and amongst the much more masculine estate papers that made up the rest of the muniments room. Remaining labels on the bookcases include tenants, leases and agreements, and annual rentals. Pigeonhole labels in French also suggest that papers relating to Sabine, who was Rowland's Swiss wife, were similarly preserved in this room. That these papers, alongside the letters from Mary and Charlotte, may have appeared together with those relating directly to estate management demonstrates how, at Nostell, women's paper traces were archived, stored, and preserved alongside those of a more formal and masculine nature. The muniments room at Nostell suggests that, though emotionally and geographically removed, the sisters were textually present in the house through the preservation of their papers. As James Daybell has noted, these letters were, I'm quoting here, monumentalized, considered worthy of preservation, and assumed a particular status within the household. In this context, Mary's and Charlotte's paper traces coexist not only with the masculine elements of estate management, but also with the patrilineal ancestry of the family name. Paradoxically, it is through their brother's objective and somewhat impersonal archiving that the sisters have a place in their family lineage, despite their ongoing emotional and familial displacement. Rowland's transformation of his sister's letters from familial correspondence to financial accounts meant that they were not necessarily out of place in a setting such as the muniments room. The preservation of such papers in a space dedicated to estate management meant that while emotionally displaced from their family, Mary and Charlotte were textually present and thus inherited. Ultimately, in treating his sister's manuscripts with a degree of distance, the 5th Baronet ironically ensured their survival in the family's history, a process which attests to the power of seemingly unimportant papers and their material inscriptions. Thank you.
Thank you, that was really interesting. Well, we're just going to keep running right through. So our next paper is John Lobreglio, Inheriting Someone Else's Family. John is a senior lecturer in Japanese studies at Oxford Brookes University, and he is the editor of Eastern Buddhist Academic Journal. So he's doing something kind of different today, but it sounds like a really interesting paper. So I'm going to hand over to John.
Yes, 10 minutes will fly by. So the first thing I need to do is very much thank Professor Beggiato for inviting me to give this paper. It has provided me with the opportunity to do something with a cache of materials that I've had on hand now for some 25 years that I didn't really know what to do with. So I've started investigating them. So thank you. The title of this talk is inheriting someone else's family. And I'll explain that as I go along. When I was a graduate student about 30 years ago in Kyoto in Japan, I was bicycling along a river and I saw what turned out to be, it was a foreigner, it was a Serbian man inside of a truck smashing up a Japanese tansu, which is a beautiful piece of furniture. He was smashing things up, and I saw him about to smash it. I said, "Stop!" I said, "Could I have that?" And he turned to his boss, who was a Japanese man, and said, "Could this guy have it?" The boss came over and said, "Sure." And we struck up a friendship. The boss, he ran a garbage removal company, but it dealt with only very large objects. And so I started talking to him, and I said, "You know, do you ever come across books?" And he said, "Yeah, all the time. What are you interested in?" And I said, "Japanese religion, Japanese history." And he said, "I'll let you know." In the meantime, for the next 5 years, we became very, very good friends. We would go out to eat often. He's a lovely man, and I'm still friends with him today. About 5 years after that meeting, I get a phone call from him, and he said, "John, this is a big one. You have to come with a car. I'm going to get loads and loads and loads of books on Japanese religion." And so I got very excited, and I met him on a street corner the next day. And it turned out the boxes were from a Shinto priest, a very high-ranking Shinto priest from one of the main Shinto temples in Kyoto. And they filled my car with boxes and boxes of books. There was a used book dealer nearby who was screaming, saying, "No, why are you giving it to him?" And the Shinto priest said, "Shut up, I'm not giving him to you. I'm giving him to this American scholar because he'll do something useful with them." But it was a few years later that I discovered that in these boxes of books were all sorts of other materials. And those are the ones I'd like to talk to you about today. There were about 80 to 100 photos, a 3-page letter, which I'll show you briefly in a moment, a 26-page manuscript, and a handful of postcards, most from the 1930s and 1940s, early 1940s. Some of the photographs have written notes on them, but most of them just have dates and the names. Many of them are group photos and the names of the people on them. The bulk of these materials, actually all of them, deal with one particular family. And within that, almost all of the material deals with the father, who was a colonel in the Imperial Japanese Army, and his son, who became a cadet in the Imperial Japanese Air Force. As I'm not quite sure, and this is something I would like to discuss in the discussion afterwards with all of you, I'm not quite sure about the ethical implications of making this material public, because I've inherited it in a very oblique sort of way. And yeah, so for the time being, I'll refer to them by their first names. The father, the colonel, is called Harunosuke, and his son is Jiro. Okay, but I won't reveal the surname for the time being. Approximately 1/3 of the photos are of Harunosuke, the father, 1/3 about the son. So it's maybe 20, 25, 30 photos of each. And the rest seem to be relatives or acquaintances of the family. Okay. Most of the photographs, many of them come from photograph studios, and they're in envelopes that are addressed to the father, they're sent to the father. Okay, so quickly a few details. The photos of Harunosuke are mostly always group shots. There are none of him just portraits on his own, as opposed to the son. The son, most of them are portraits taken in a photography studio. I can just give you a sense. I mean, I've got this stack of material by my side. I'm going to do a very a cutting edge, modern kind of screen share right now. This is the newest technology there. So, so it is these sorts of. You see the Imperial Japanese flag there. So I have quite a number of these group photos, mostly military, but some are a combination of military and administrative leaders, civil leaders. So here is a photo in front of Kyoto Imperial University at the time. Harunosuke, the colonel, is in that photograph. And it was this photograph actually that allowed me to start deciphering who was who and who the father actually was, because I'll put a piece of paper here and give you a sense over the thing. There is this schema which lists the names and ranks of positions of everyone in the photo. So this is the initial one that enabled me to figure out who Harunosuke was, and then from there I was able to decipher a good deal more. Yeah, and there's another just interest. So again, just quickly, a few of the interesting photographs. Here is one, and this is from, most of these are from around the early 1930s, 1930, 31, 32. He is in this photograph somewhere. It says in the notes on the side, and this is a group of young soldiers bowing at a Shinto shrine before going off to the Japanese Empire, which would have been at the time Korea, Manchuria, northern China. So this is the period, and most of these photographs are just before the Manchurian incident, when the Japanese army overran Manchuria and basically seized control of it. So it's in the run-up to that. And there's one other photograph. I'll just give you an idea. He was a high-ranking person. Here he's giving a lecture in Kyoto to the society. It's a lecture consoling the families, or not consoling, because that would imply they've already died, comforting the families of the soldiers who are abroad on imperial missions. And in the background, you can see some maps, and there's a map of Shanghai, and this is from 1930. So again, before the Manchurian incident, but at a time when the Japanese were increasing their presence in the mainland. So he's giving this lecture to comfort the families whose sons, and explain to them what the Japanese army is doing over in Manchuria. Okay, the photos of the son are mostly, as I said, done in studios. He has usually a very serious face. Even today, Japanese people tend not to smile. I'm not sure what the social background to this is in photographs. But here, this is a military family, and the son, he looks very, very stern, except there's a few, which I find extremely touching. One in particular with him as a young boy. Most of them are, they trace his entire childhood from when he's very small up until the time he's graduated from high school, the photographs. And there's one of him not in a school uniform. It's one of the only ones. And the school uniforms look like military uniforms at this point in Japanese history. They still do in many cases. And the boy is cuddling a puppy. And it's a photo that, for reasons I'll explain in a minute, sometimes really brings tears to my eyes. Then the most interesting and emotional document for me in the thing is this 3-page letter that Jiro wrote home to his family. It's addressed to his father, "Dear Sir," in his final year, 1940, January of 1940, as a cadet in the Japanese Imperial Air Force. I'll just say a few things about the details of the letter in a moment at the end. This is probably, for professional historians, might be the most interesting document. It was bound at one point, but the covers have fallen off, and it's comprised of 26 handwritten pages like that. Now, one of the problems why I haven't been able to do much with this over the past 25 years, besides being busy, has been that this kind of script is incredibly difficult to read. It's a stylized kind of calligraphy. So after discussing this first with Professor Beggiato maybe a year and a half ago or 2 years ago, I guess just before the lockdown, I started asking around for Japanese specialists. And the first 4, who were Japanese language teachers, looked at it and said, sorry, we can't make heads or tail of that. So finally, I found someone, and it's just in the last couple of months that he's been able to, he's a Japanese librarian, and in his spare time, he is slowly and painstakingly transcribing this for me. And he was able to transcribe that letter actually for me. And so of this document, we've only got about 3 of the 26 pages. What it seems, and we don't know who wrote it. I'm hoping it was by Harunosuke, but we just don't know. And it seems to be jottings about Meiji period history, so late 19th, early 20th century histories, in particular a leading statesman of the time. So somebody is writing a manuscript about a leading statesman. What this all will mean eventually, I don't know. Okay. I will try to wrap this up. Okay, so yes. I've got more questions than answers, really, but I'd just like to give you a sense. I would really like to know what the relationship between the priest who gave all these materials away is to these people. He was about to retire. That's why he got rid of all of these books. And I think he was about 65 or 70 at the time, and that was 25 years ago. That would make him 90 to 95 today if he were still alive. What was his relationship to this family? Did he know that these materials were in these boxes? Was he trying to unload these materials, or did they go astray? I'm guessing it was most likely the latter, but there were many Japanese who were very embarrassed about this period of their history, the militarism, and probably not so interested in preserving this type of imperialism and militarist history. Yeah, and so ultimately I have more questions, and this is why I'm really attracted to this project and love to get some feedback. What am I to make of this, of all of this? If the priest did want to get rid of the material, what am I doing resurrecting it? Are there any descendants left who might care about these photos and these materials? If so, I would very much like to return them to them. So this is what I would like to do. If not, if I cannot find any descendants, then what? What do I do with this? So the biggest impact upon me of looking at and living with these materials for 25 years and taking them out and looking at the photos, and it was only about 2 years ago that I deciphered who was who and that this was a military family, and I actually looked carefully at the names and the ranks and things. But what the biggest impact on me has not been anything to do with professional history with a capital H. It's been rather something to do with the pure emotionality of a really human story, namely the tragic nature of war and loss. And I know a statement like that sounds very abstract, but when I'm looking at photographs of this father and of this beautiful young boy at various stages of his youth, and I read this letter of, even now I get very, very emotional looking at it. I read a letter where this boy, Jiro, away from his family at the Air Force Academy, is longing to be home. He says he wants to just be chilling out and sharing meals with his family, but he's doing his best to make his father proud. I imagine Harunosuke opening the 3-page letter from his son Jiro, nodding with proud approval as he describes his fine military saber and his upcoming graduation and promotion to the rank of officer. In all of these materials, to stack like this, there is only one photograph that is clearly from the post-war period. There are no, and I'll describe that in a second, there are no post-war photographs of Jiro. The fact that he was an officer in the Japanese Air Force makes that not very surprising. It is very unlikely that he would have survived the war. I cannot help but wonder on which side of the podium was Harunosuke situated after learning something of the fate of his son Jiro. Would he have once again been comforting the audience with stories of military glories of earlier periods of Japanese history, or would he have been sitting in the audience on the receiving end of the lecture? If the latter, what could he possibly have made of such a consolatory lecture? There is only one photo in the entire collection that seems to be clearly from the post-war period, and that is of Harunosuke with his distinctive sharp mustache now shaved. And he's performing on a nose stage that seems to have fallen into disrepair. With the ritual fan symbolizing a shamanic rod held in his right hand at shoulder level, and his left hand pointing earnestly at the ground just before him, he stares solemnly, trance-like, over the fan and off into the distance. I can't help but wonder, was he the shite, the main actor, in a shuramono, or warrior play, walking slowly toward the ghost of a dead soldier appearing to him in a dream? That's it.
Yeah, thank you for that. Fascinating and so many great questions. Again, we're going to keep moving. Is Alison, did she still manage to be on screen at this point?
I can now see you, and I can actually hear you and see you all now, thank goodness. I am here.
Excellent. So Alison made it through the storms, and she's going to talk today, and actually in a similar way to John, about two suitcases, but this is a personal suitcases, and a personal reflection on the family archive. And Alison was awarded her PhD from the University of Roehampton last year, and her thesis focused on married women who killed their children and then ended up in various sorts of asylums. And her book on that topic is out next year, I think. But today she's talking about something slightly differently. So go on.
Right, I'll try now to share my screen and see if it will let me do that. There we go. Share. And there's my slideshow. Excuse me, I have to pull this down a bit. I can't get into, I'm sorry about this, I just can't get into showing this.
Don't worry, Alison, probably if you just put your cursor over each slide as you move through.
What it is, I've got this, hang on, let me just see if I can get rid of you at the moment. There we go. Play from start. Wait, is that it? Can you see it now? Okay.
We can still just see the same screen, so we'll see if when you start to move through.
Pause. Hang on, for some unknown reason, bring my. No, I don't know. Let me go. Stop the share and try again. Right. I'm sorry about this. It's taking up my 10 minutes doing this.
Don't panic. We'll figure it out.
There we go. Can you see that?
That's perfect.
Right. Okay. I'll see if it goes on now. Anyway, thank you. As a start, I've always known about my two suitcases. They've been kept in the loft of my parents' house and my grandparents' house for all my life. I knew they contained family treasures, but in their latter years, and I occasionally spent time with my parents going through one or two or other of the suitcases with the objective of mainly looking for photographs to add faces to biographies that I was digging up in our family history research. My parents and I would have long discussions about our family history and the characters therein. I now wish I'd recorded what they said to me. However, my father died in August 2018 and my mother in March of this year. After her death, my brother rediscovered the 2 vintage suitcases and passed them on to me as he described me, holder of the family archive. The documents, photographs and letters and other general family ephemera are a somewhat eclectic array of papers. The expected papers are there, like birth, marriage, death certificates, but there are also so many more rather random papers. What I found disconcerting and disturbing were our individual reactions to the contents. Now, it'd be very unfair of me and wrong of me to discuss my brother's emotional reactions. So I'll try and express how I reacted from a purely personal perspective. It was difficult to decide how to do this in just 10 minutes without it becoming a poor man's who do you think you are, and difficult to shorten it as well. So I will jump from one subject to another. I believe some of the documents, ephemera, while holding memory for us and emotions for the family, also hold cultural, historical value. It was actually Joanne who said to me that the contents of my suitcases speak to my family history, but also to a national history. To this end, I've looked at the impact of the World Wars on my grandparents and my parents' lives. I'll then scoot through some of the other stuff in the cases with the overall intention of analysing in a personal way how an odd collection of family bits and bobs can encapsulate the history of ourselves. Starting with photographs, which to me do not actually stir a great emotive response. I'm not saying they're not of great interest and fascinating, but my reactions were not as visceral as they were with other items. The title of the slide, Treasured Photographs, was written by my mother on the outside of an envelope which contained a certain collection of family photographs. I believe she hit the nail on the head with the description. The earliest was taken about the 1870s and the latest in the 1960s. The majority, though, are Edwardian and Victorian and record my maternal grandparents' families, the McCartneys and the Abercrombies. The family members all pictured here did not come from wealthy backgrounds in the slightest, but were determined to better themselves through education, hard work, and a very, very strong evangelical free church belief. There are many other photographs in the cases as well, including some of my and many of my paternal side of the family, the Shakespeares. For me, to hold documents and artifacts which my forebears held, read, and indeed wrote is how I connect with them and their stories. To me, the photographs are just the icing on the cake. Having said that, I do find myself looking at them, searching out family likenesses in me, my brother, my 2 nephews, and my son. And I ask myself, is this me trying to cement my place in the family tree, affirm my heritage, or assuage some deep-seated need to be part of the past? Moving on from this, the next slides review the cataclysmic effect that world events could have on ordinary life and how I feel about a close brush with this past. The discovery of my grandfather's war service papers was sobering and heartrending. Like so many of his generation, he never spoke of his war experiences, yet he kept all his military papers and photographs of his unit. And that photograph down at the bottom, it shows at Sling Camp when he first joined up. And he is right in the middle with the moustache. He's with a big grin on his face, which disappeared. He was a stretcher bearer on the Somme. And the family story was that he was the survivor of a shell attack, which killed his partner and the man on a stretcher. I'm sure this was probably the case, but whatever, he was transferred to No. 1 hospital train on the 31st of August, 1916, recorded as suffering from shell shock. Eventually, he was transferred to Fuse Hill Military Hospital in Carlisle, where it was recorded that he was suffering from VDH, or valvular disease of the heart. Here, this is the photograph of my grandpa in his hospital blues, and it had a very deep effect on me. I think he looks haunted and deeply sad. My grandparents got engaged in 1915 and married in 1920. There are a few of their letters in the suitcase as well, but I quote this one, the end of this one, because it actually made me cry. The significance was in the date. I believe it was written just as my grandfather was on the point of being sent to France. Through these personal photographs and letters and the collection of papers, I realized that even though it was over 100 years ago, People I knew and people I loved were actually part of that terrible war. My father was just 14 and my mother 12 when the Second World War broke out. The two photographs here, the later photographs, show them at 16 and 17, although I think they look a bit older than that. When my son was 7, both my mother and father wrote him letters about when they were young. It was part of a school project about children before and during World War II. He'd obviously had a long conversation with my parents, asking them about their childhood. I found their copies, kept in one of the cases, and again they amazed me the way they could pass on their life experience to future generations. In September 1939, my mother was evacuated from Birmingham to Cheltenham, whereas my father, living on the more rural Wirral, easy to say, shared his home with evacuees from Liverpool. My mother's house suffered bomb damage, and yes, that is the tail fin to the bomb that went through her bed, which is also in the case. Whereas my father always told of standing in his bedroom window watching Liverpool burn. In the letters to Tom, my mother wrote about her evacuation experiences and my father about his 1930s childhood. It told me a lot about them, how the war impacted in different ways. My mother chose to tell of her home front life, whereas my dad went back to his childhood. Their relative experiences must have impacted greatly on them. And for me, looking at their experiences now and hearing about their young selves speaking through contemporary letters actually made me very sad for the loss of their youth at the time. Changing tack away from the World War to even earlier times, in the cases are letters from my great-great-grandfather, Samuel McCartney, to his daughter-in-law, my great-grandmother, Carrie, sent from New Zealand to England in 1888 and 1914. From watching genealogical programs and from contacts I received when I was researching my PhD thesis, I believe that most people, and I do include myself in that, want to find an errant ancestor, someone with an interesting story, a criminal or a runaway father. Samuel McCartney is my errant ancestor. I already had the bare outlines of his story, and as I say, I put those on the screen, and we were always told that he'd run away to sea, and leaving my great-grandfather with his grandparents in Northern Ireland to be brought up to work on the linen mills. Samuel, as I say, was born in 1833, and later on in his letters, he actually mentions the Irish potato famine in 1847, which happened a lot in County Down. After he married in 1852, he actually went out to Newcastle, where my grandfather was born, and he was actually working in an ironworks. But then after his wife died of TB, that's when he went home and left young John, 18 months old, with his parents, and actually joined the Royal Navy as a stoker on HMS Vulcan, amongst other ships. He was discharged from service in 1864 in China and ended up in Australia. He then made his way to New Zealand, where in 1865 he got involved in the gold rush in Otago. He died and was buried in 1914 in Hokitika. Poignantly, there is a letter amongst this collection from Agnes, his wife, to her mother-in-law, written in July 1854, telling her about John's birth and trying to make amends over a family falling out between Samuel and his parents. This rift seems to have carried on down the years and maybe answers why that my great-grandfather never spoke to his father again. Samuel only returned once to his native island in about 1882 to find John. He went to Comber, where my other great-great-grandfather, John Harris, was the local Baptist minister, and his daughter Carrie was about to marry said John McCartney. John refused to see his father. Oh, all right. There we go. John refused to see his father, but my great-grandmother did and stayed in touch with Samuel until his death. There were 8 letters in total. The earliest was, as I say, written in 1888, and the last just before his death in December 1914. The letters are a fascinating commentary on New Zealand of the late 1800s, and for the occasional throwaway comment on Samuel's views of his native island. What I find personally interesting is the determination of my great-grandmother to reach out and include Samuel in her children's lives. And by his death in 1914, even my great-grandfather had taken note, and he kept the letters safe in a cigar box, one of 2 in the cases. Of course, a historian of 19th century New Zealand would, I'm sure, be very interested in Samuel's first-hand accounts of a young country. Amongst other bits of news, he also comments on the politics of the day, both in the UK and in NZ. And on a more personal note, my son now lives in Otago. So I am going to transcribe these letters and send them out to him. But even though Samuel was an early Kiwi citizen, I don't think that'll get Tommy's residency somehow. Ugh. I'm sorry. The 2 cigar boxes, as I mentioned, contain smaller items and some very random bits and pieces, documents, and even more letters. One of them clearly belonged to my father, and obviously the contents meant a lot to him, like the little notes from me and my brother when we were small, or his RAF discharge book, or his various sports club membership cards. Personally, I found these probably some among the more moving things, but I guess that reaction comes more from my connection with him than anything else. I think part of my reactions to the other items in the cases comes from my historian's brain and the excitement of handling 100-year-old documents, photographs, filling in gaps in a story, proving or disproving family legends, etc. On the other hand, when it comes to later stuff, such as that from my own childhood, the emotions are perhaps more from nostalgia for times past. So thinking about what Joanne said about our national history, I realised just as my grandparents and my parents' experiences connected me to national British history, Samuel's letters linked my family to other national histories too. The brief mention of the potato famine in County Down connected me in 2021 to a boy of 13 in 1847 Ireland. Then again, his mention of the New Zealand gold rush connected my son in 21st century Otago to a young colony in 1865. Maybe that's what's so important about the written word, and particularly letters. The immediacy of the writer to such happenings speaks down the years to future generations. So what of the future? What made the recipients of the letters and the owners of all those bits and bobs in the 2 suitcases actually hang on to them? I believe my parents and my grandparents and their parents onwards and backwards must have attached meaning and importance to the items, either at a deep emotional level in recording cataclysmic events or from some sort of sense of evangelical duty. Whether it was foresight to keep future generations informed or pure sentimentality, I guess is debatable. What I wonder is what my descendants will find and keep of my ephemera today. In my opinion, there isn't the same sense of permanence or importance in emails or photographs. What will we leave for future generations? So many items in those 2 suitcases stir different feelings, but at the end of the day, probably only a true meaning to me and my family. I suppose that there are a potted history of my Scottish, Irish, Birmingham Wirral lineage, and if it doesn't sound too big-headed, give me connections and a very small place in history. Thank you.
Thank you, that was really great. Another really lovely paper. We're moving straight along now onto our last paper for today, which is Lucy B. Dutton. I keep meaning to do something with the diary. Lucy is an independent scholar who got her PhD from Birkbeck University of London a couple of years ago, and her thesis looks at the British filmmaker Maurice Elvey in the First World War. And since then, she's published a number of pieces on various silent films. And her current research focus is on stitching in Hilary Mantel's Cromwell trilogy, which sounds really very fascinating. But I'll hand over to Lucy now for her paper today.
Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen and that's it. Great. So, well, thank you very much for asking me to speak today. I'm just going to start by saying I don't really do family. And I don't have children of my own, so some of my reflections are based around what you do when you're slightly dislocated. And I'm just going to start with telling you about one of the most offensive things that's ever been said to me by a woman of my own age, who said to me, "You must really regret not having children because you've got nobody to leave anything to." Funnily enough, she's not on my Christmas card list anymore. But today I'm going to talk about my grandfather's diary and some other documents. The first words that my grandfather recorded in his diary were, "I started smoking with father's consent 2 days before Christmas, both pipe and cigarettes." And my grandfather wrote that in 1916 when he was 18 and serving with the King's Liverpool Regiment. It was smoking that did for him when he was in his 60s. But back in 1916, it was a statement of adulthood, as befitting a young man who joined up at just 17 the previous year. Now, I never knew my grandfather, but I inherited his diary and his notebooks from sniper training. I inherited his war medals, and I inherited photographs of him and his young friends who he served with. They're kept in a bag in my house, which I rarely open. My father left me these items and others, which are still in a wooden box in what is now my mother's home. And one of the problems with the box is that I don't really know what's in it. My father died in 2013. At Christmas 2009, he showed me a regimental photograph of the King's Liverpool Regiment and pointed out where my grandfather was. And of course, I couldn't tell you now where he is in the picture. My dad said he wanted to go through the box with me so that I would understand what was in there. But sadly, just a couple of weeks later, my father was taken ill and he never returned home. And we never had the opportunity to go through the box. So I don't really understand what's in it. But after my father died, I opened the box and I took what looked like the most interesting items home with me. Every now and then, I get the items out and I wonder what I'm going to do with them. When I first brought them home back in 2013, I found that the easiest things to deal with were the photographs. They were studio portraits of my grandfather and his friends. I had some nice new prints made and I sent a set to my father's younger sister. I looked at how young my grandfather was and how young his friends were, because really they were just kids. For a while, I got really interested in websites with photographs of old First World War troops, and I'm convinced that I saw my grandfather in one of them. It was the right regiment and the right battalion, and I showed the picture to my mother, who said, "I don't think that's your grandfather," but I'm pretty sure it was. Because the thing was that I knew the faces of his friends from the studio portraits, and they were in that photograph. Online, I even managed to find a picture of his friend Stuart, about whom my grandfather often wrote in his diary. The box also contained correspondence that my father had had with both my grandfather's regiment and the Imperial War Museum in the early 1980s. My dad was trying to find out about his father's war experiences. The Imperial War Museum responded with some photographs. The regiment wrote that they were unable to help with the names that my father had sent them. And this must have been around the time that I asked my father, I must have been about 12, "Was your dad at the Battle of the Somme?" And when my dad said no, he was at Ypres, I wasn't really interested, because it felt somehow disappointing to a 12-year-old who didn't know anything. And I look back on that and I think, what a terrible reaction. But then I remember my father telling me that he once asked his father, "What's the bravest thing you ever did in the war?" expecting a tale of great daring do. And the answer was so low key that I now can't even remember what it was. My father, who must have been about 10 at the time, then went on to ask his dad, and this must have been in about 1939, "What would you do if you saw Hitler walking down the street?" He was underwhelmed when my grandfather would reply, "I would go and fetch a policeman." I regret that I didn't know my father was attempting this research until it was too late, because if just a few years later, I could have helped him. And to try to make up for my lack of family connection, I added my grandfather to the Lives of the First World War database. But I didn't put in many details, just his service record. And then there's the diary. It's from 1916 and it's faded badly, but you can just make out a bugler on the front cover and the words "Duty's Call." It's a soldier's own diary, and it reminds me of the boy's own paper, which perhaps my grandfather had only recently stopped reading. There's a patriotic message from the King on the front, and a note that a diary kept by a soldier on active service will certainly form the most valued mementos of a man's life. And it's now in a bag in the house of a woman its owner never met. I could learn how to make a field kitchen, tie knots, find my direction using the pole star. I could learn to play a bugle call or use the Soldier's Guide to French. I am instructed sternly to report facts, not fancies. Do not exaggerate. And I do none of these things. Instead, I look at my grandfather's diary entries. He wrote in it every single day. And a place name jumps out at me. Dane John, sentry duty at Dane John. My grandfather was, for much of the duration of this diary, stationed at Canterbury. I did my first degree at the University of Kent, and I lived in Canterbury, and I walked regularly by the Dane John Mound, and I had no idea that my grandfather did his training there. Now, as Katie mentioned, I wrote my PhD thesis about 1910s British cinema, focusing on a British filmmaker called Maurice Elvey. And I know that my grandfather was a great cinema goer. And so I'm hoping that his diary can tell me about his cinema going habits. Maybe he even recorded seeing a film made by Elvey that's now lost, and it's going to be a great breakthrough in my research. Imagine my disappointment when I painstakingly decipher the handwriting and find that while he often went to the pictures twice a week, in most cases, he didn't record the titles of the films he saw. He did record 3 of them, however. He sometimes says where he saw them and whether it was a good show, but there's not really enough to go on. But on the 2nd of September, he did record going to see the film The Battle of the Somme while he was on leave. For that day, he recorded that he went to a lecture in the mess tent by Captain G in the morning. He got paid, it was very wet. And then Ted and I got weekend passes and left by 2:20 train for London. Stayed at his sister's in Clapham. Mrs. Giles, who I don't know who Mrs. Giles is, but Mrs. Giles took us out after tea, but couldn't get with any theatre, so went to the pictures. Saw Battle of the Somme. Lovely to come back to hot supper and find bed. Mrs. G is very good and takes any amount of trouble to give us a good time. Now, it might seem an odd choice for a soldier on leave to go and watch a film about the Battle of the Somme, but it was an enormously popular film, and it's estimated that 20 million people saw it in 1916, and it was showing everywhere. So it's not surprising that my grandfather went to see that, if that was what was on offer. The other issue about documents of this type is that sometimes we see what we want to. I'm very excited when on the 28th of July, the entry simply reads, "Film made." So I start wondering, was this a regimental record? Regimental films were taken and they were shown in cinemas, and you can find traces of them in local newspaper advertisements, and some even survive. So if I can track down this regimental film of the King's Liverpool Regiment, maybe I'll actually be able to see my grandfather on film. But then, using a magnifying glass, I look more closely at the writing, and what it actually reads is firing practice. My grandfather's handwriting is very difficult to read. He records other leisure activities. He went to the London Palladium, and if I took the trouble, I could probably find the programme for the date in question. He saw Ada Reid on stage at the Empire in The Modern Eve, and he must have enjoyed it because it's rare for the name of an actor to be recorded. The only other one is Little Titch, who he saw in pantomime while he was on leave at home in Liverpool. And I remember that I've seen Little Titch's shoes in the Victoria and Albert Museum. Or have I? When I go and check the V&A's accession record, I find that they're not actually the shoes that were worn by Little Titch, but worn by Lupino Lane, impersonating Little Titch. So there's another layer of distance. But on the 19th of February, he records seeing a film called The Mystery of a Hansom Cab at the St. George's in Canterbury. I've been in that cinema. I watched films in there when I was a student, and the mystery of a hansom cab comes up as a footnote in my thesis. He later records going to see a film called Jelfs and surprisingly describes it as a London film, and British film is thought of as not having been seen very much in this period, but we know now that it was. But the fact that my grandfather describes this as a London film is, to me, really, really interesting, because I did so much research into the London Film Company. So this immediately means something to me. The London Film Company comes up in my thesis, as does its director, George Lone Tucker. So as you can tell, I am trying to find some sort of connection with my grandfather. I'm not interested in the situation with the girl that my grandfather took to the cinema that he wrote about, but the film that he saw is of great interest. In January, he records that he's proud of having written a piece called, I think, She Found Life, and he sends it to Titbits for publication. And later, on that diary entry, he records a cross note, no, washout. I consider using no, washout as a code for myself to write on rejected grant proposals. But can I do anything more than this? I've seen people tweet diaries or use them as the basis for fiction, but I'm not sure I could do that. I didn't know my grandfather, and I don't know what I think of him. But there is another piece of writing that I can do something with. In my bag of odd possessions, there's a cutting from the Radio Times and a typed account of memories of being a rifleman or sniper scout on the Western Front in February 1917. My grandfather wrote this in response to the BBC's call for war memories when they were making their landmark series, The Great War. They were making it in 1963 and it was broadcast throughout 1964. He kept a copy of what he wrote, and it's beautifully written. And I know that I definitely need to do something with that because I don't think the BBC did. And yesterday I tweeted the whole thing out. I felt okay about doing this because my grandfather meant it to be seen. He wrote it for the BBC to be included in the programme, and he actually died before the relevant episode of The Great War was broadcast. And I wanted to do something to make up for his no washout rejection. This piece of writing was meant for public consumption, and I felt it should be shared. And looking at my Twitter account, it looks like a lot of people have read it and found it interesting or even moving. But as for doing anything else, there are family complications, there are estrangements, there's distance, there's people not really knowing each other anymore. So I'm a bit stuck about what to do with all of this stuff. As I said earlier, I don't have children. So what do I do with it? Does anyone else even know that I have it? And does anyone care? I only ended up with it by chance. My father was his father's only son, and my father was interested in the First World War. So I imagine he found the papers and decided to keep them. And then he knew that I was interested in history, although at the time when he tried to talk to me about this, when I was about 12, I wasn't that interested. I became interested later on. So it was left to me. I keep meaning to do something with the diary, but for now it sits in a bag, which I very rarely open. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. That's it, 4 really fabulous papers, and the themes I think are really strong. You can kind of see all the connections between them. I was particularly thinking about the kind of like themes around imagination and connection, and the way that we have these objects and we have to kind of do that imaginary work to try and build up a larger kind of picture. I'm just fixing all my views so I can see you all. There we go. So now we're opening the floor to discussion and comments and questions. You're over 2 screens for me, so bear with me if I don't see you, but yeah, you can use your little hand waving or just physically wave with your camera, or put a question in the chat if you'd prefer. So over to you guys. I think Helen, has she got one there? Sorry.
Yes, just, well, loads of thoughts inspired by all that. Just a sort of quite practical question for John. It just made me wonder where the Japanese are in terms of genealogy and doing family history, because it's not something I know anything about. Because the obvious thing, if it was a Western person, you'd look up the family on Ancestry. Do the Japanese do that kind of thing? Do they have a tradition of keeping family trees?
That is a fantastic question. And let me answer it in this way. In terms of today, contemporary Japan, I'm not really sure. And so your question makes me think that is a good avenue for me to start exploring right off the bat. Taking a step back from the trees and looking at the forest, the Japanese historically are very, very meticulous about the preservation of history. And aristocratic families are very, very concerned about genealogy and preserving family histories. So the answer is, from the deep historical perspective, and we see this also compared to, say, like even China and very much India. Japan has an extraordinary amount of archival records, and especially about, if you want to study Buddhism, you go to Japan. If you want to study Chinese Buddhism, you go to Japan, because they have an extraordinary amount of material. But contemporary Japanese people, it's very, very interesting, and this is something that I will certainly look into. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I have a question for Katie, if nobody else wants to go. I was quite interested in the way that these were filed along with the business correspondence, and it made me go, did he do that with all his all his families, or was it just these sisters? I mean, did he have like the wife's letters or the children's letters that were kept in a more familiar archive, shall we say? And how did you think about those differences?
Yeah, well, it's all quite like, there's quite a lot of family drama at the end of the 18th century where they're like not very good with money, and there's a few fallings out when he dies before his wife about who looks after the children. So they're not all filed together. No, he keeps his wife's papers quite as you would expect, like emotionally, they're quite treasured objects as opposed to the sisters' ones. And so he has got other sisters as well that do marry, but they're usually filed with like their husband's papers rather than as a separate set by themselves. But yeah, in terms of like the correspondence, they much more resemble the correspondence between like the architects and the designers for the house rather than the family.
And there's so much to unpack there, I think. Any other kind of comments or questions? Joanne?
Thank you. Yes, I know, just a marvellous set of talks, and I guess one of the things that was quite interesting emerging out of them is that sense of responsibility for family objects and family archives, and that it doesn't have to be your own biological family. And I do think there's something there that we could explore about those connections, the meaning that family has as an institution, and emotions more generally. You know, that families, as I say, not just those personal connections, but families in themselves, the feelings that they generate. In that, I'm interested, are there any other kinds of objects that you might come across in an antique shop or a car boot fair, which would give you that sense of, I must do something with this, I must return it to its you know, family of origin, or if it's mine, I can't necessarily throw it away. But of course, then the other thing that follows from that is there are plenty of families who do discard their inherited objects and or stuff that is passed on to them, which doesn't necessarily have a particular kind of emotional meaning, and is the stuff that ends up out there for someone else to take on and feel a sense of responsibility about. So I'm quite interested in all that complexity, and I do think there is something specific about the family that seems to generate these kinds of feelings, and yeah, so it's more of a comment about that sense of responsibility, and I think for someone like John, we are increasingly coming across in this project people who work very hard to return the artifacts that they find to their families of origin. Quite often it's photographs, because those are the ones that are annotated with names and dates. And we want to do something, a sort of side, a project around this, get someone to write about this, and because clearly it's a practice which is fairly well established. Yes, so forgive me, more of a lengthy comment than a question, but please, anyone that wants to come in and comment further, please do.
I think Alison wants to talk.
Well, actually, going back to when I was talking about emotions on my thing, you just actually hit a nail on the head there, Joanne. Obviously, John and my brother and I are going through these very odd emotions about what do we do. But about objects, my mother and my father specifically left in their wills, left John a hall table that was in my grandparents' house, her parents' house, and me a very nice cabinet with a little knick-knack cabinet that's got a lot of my grandmother's knick-knacks in. And I've got that at home, that's fine. My brother is actually on the horns of a dilemma. This table is the ugliest thing you've ever seen, but it was in the hall of my grandparents' house. They had a big Victorian house before they moved to their retirement bungalow. It was been in the hall of our parents' house, and it's got 2 drawers that were stuffed full of photographs, which he's now thrown at me, and I've got those. And he said to me on the phone just the other day, "What am I going to do with that table?" He said, "I hate the thing. It's been part of my life for the last 65 years, but I don't want it. But Mum left it to me, so what can I do?" And I think that sometimes it's when it's something specific, it stirs up another emotion inside. I'm being typical little sister. I just said, "Well, I'm okay. I got the nice cabinet." But that's, but yes, what you're saying about objects, it's in some ways it's more difficult than documents because they fill a bigger space. And, modern houses don't take Victorian furniture. So yeah, it's a comment as well, a comment on your comment, really, that, is it something within some families that we have a sense of our past and we feel that we ought to keep these things? Is it our historian's brain? As it happens, my brother is a historian as well, but I don't know. It is an inner thing. I just don't know. I'm sorry. That's all I was going to say, and that's why I was interested in what Lucy was saying as well, because basically you're asking the same question. What do I do with this? I feel I ought to keep it, but should I? Or should I pass it on to a museum? Should I pass it somewhere else? It's a dilemma, I believe.
We've got a little queue lining up of questions now. So there's Kate first, and then there's Linda, and then there's Alison.
Hi, yes. I was just really picking up on some of the comments about the objects, and we haven't children either, and I never like getting rid of anything that belonged to any ancestors. We've got loads of things. So what do we do with them? And it was a question I was going to raise next week, actually, after my talk. And really, I wondered whether or not something like a National Family History Museum is needed. Something where objects can go. I mean, obviously documents are of interest to archives or family history societies. But what about objects? Where do they go? The stories that we have about the objects, where can they go? There needs to be somewhere where they can go with the family history or with history of the actual object. I am one of these people, as Joanne was just saying, where if I see an article in an antique shop, in a junk shop, and I think I can find the original owner, I've done this I've got a collection of items over the last few years where I have an item and I researched the original owner, and I have actually managed to trace it down to living individuals. And it is my intention to return it to the family along with details of their family history, which is something I haven't quite got to that last stage yet. Because I have this need, I see these items and I think they should be with somebody in the family, So yeah, I just really wanted to express those thoughts, really. I'll be really interested to see if anybody else has got any other ideas of what to do with these objects, because they should be somewhere.
Fascinating. Does anyone want to comment on that, or we could go to Linda? Linda, it's you.
Hi, sorry, I was having trouble unmuting. I suppose it's just picking up on those comments and on my own personal experience. It's just sort of how interesting that these sort of sometimes very mundane objects that you inherit open up windows into your memories of your childhood homes, your grandparents' homes, and then you're repeating patterns of behaviour that your parents have obviously gone through with their family. And for me, I found it a really interesting way of tapping into different memories of my childhood and opening different routes into it. And so it was just a vague comment, but I think that's one of the things which I found really fascinating. It's been really interesting hearing those sort of picked up. And again, then when you get something which doesn't belong to you at all, you're viewing it in quite a different light. But I do think with your own objects, it's quite interesting, just those different patterns which come through. So sorry, that's a bit rambly, but
there's an interesting connection here as well between the idea that objects are part of, belong and extend families into the future, so that when the family ends and then the objects kind of almost become dislocated as well, as those two things kind of go together. But I'll pass over to Alison, Baxter, who's the next question.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to reflect on something that I think I'm going to pick up on next week, about what we do with things that come to us from aunts and uncles and cousins who have no direct descendants. I mean, I ended up with a few mementos from my father's cousin Doris, she was worked all her life as a civil servant. She was a career woman. She never married. She never had children. My father was left to deal with her estate. He obviously had been quite fond of her and hung on to a brooch, a couple of china figurines and a photograph album. And of course, when my father died, these ended up in the box of stuff that we cleared from the house. And I took them and thought, well, I knew cousin Doris, not very well, but I did know her. I don't feel right about disposing of these mementos of her life. There is nobody who's going to come after me who's going to have any memory of this woman. And I kind of struggled with that because I really disliked these china figurines. And in the end, I arranged to sell them and give the proceeds to a charity that I was supporting. So hopefully they've gone to somebody who will enjoy them and the money's gone to a good cause. But I am stuck with the photograph album where you don't recognize anybody. My father's put a note on saying, well, I believe the couple in these pictures are Doris's parents, Gilbert and whoever. Gilbert was a half brother of my grandfather. And it's just sitting there. And I suppose I've come to the conclusion that luckily, I believe my daughter is a great deal more ruthless than me. And at the moment, at least, is much less interested in all things historical. So I've decided that basically this is going to become her problem, along with a whole load of other stuff that I'm not prepared at this stage to dispose of.
It actually reminds me of, I used to work in a museum and they had a policy where eventually they would just take your stuff if you were very desperate to get rid of it and bin it for you, and you had to sign a document saying you were happy with that. But it seemed that some people just could not bin their stuff, but they could allow someone else to do that on their behalf, which is, there's a whole fascinating thing there as well. Felicity, I think, is next.
Hi, this has been absolutely fascinating this morning, so thank you. I'm also have no children, have inherited quite a lot of things, but one of the things that I keep thinking of, particularly when someone mentioned the idea of having a museum of family objects, is I think we have to let these objects go off and have another life. You know, if you think about the biography of objects, I'm quite happy with the idea of, so I also inherited some really horrible china figures, which we sold. And I'm really happy that they've gone on to be with someone who liked them, who bought them. And I think that there is I know it in myself, there is a danger of feeling a sense of obligation to these material objects that may or may not be valid, actually. And I have had papers from my great uncle, who was actually the director of the Guildhall Library in the middle 20th century. And I've donated that to the Guildhall Archive because the papers track his professional trajectory. And I, as a historian, I know how frustrating it is when you know that people haven't kept things that would be useful for you. And I would rather lodge things in archives or sell them on so they can have another life. And that's something that I'm wrestling with it, but I'm trying really hard to enact that. So I just wanted to kind of, yeah, flag up the life cycle of an object doesn't have to end with the family member.
Okay, great comment. Jane is next in the queue.
Hi, I'm a professional family historian. I research family trees for clients, and one of the things that comes up quite frequently with clients is that they say, I know nothing about my family, I don't have any documents, I don't have any papers, I would like to know, what can you find out, can you help me? And one of the things that sometimes comes out of that is that if you go back 2 or 3 or 4 generations, you get into the period in time where families were very large, there were many siblings, and often things have come down another line of the family, often the female line of the family. Things, it can be photographs, it can also be stories. Stories often pass down the female lines of the family more than the male lines. They tend to talk more and pass stories on. And sometimes if you track back a few and then go sideways and track forward, you can identify family photos and family stories that have come down another branch of the family. And you can put sometimes second or third cousins together and allow these connections to be made and these objects and stories to be shared. So that's kind of the flip side of having things that you don't know what to do with. And some of those sideways branches will be what in family tree terms you would refer to as a dead end. There are no, there's nobody to inherit, but there may be third cousins out there who are desperate to find out about earlier phases, who haven't inherited anything, who haven't had stories for whatever reason, who are desperate to find this stuff and are paying people like me to try and unearth it. So yes, maybe not current cousin Doris, who is your contemporary and had bad taste in furniture, you know, that might not be what they're looking for. But if it's old, if it's stuff that's been passed down to you from several generations back, somebody out there might desperately be looking for this stuff and will be very, very glad to be reunited with it. So in my family, my father was an only child. His father had a younger sister who died in childhood, so he was effectively an only child. But his father had 11 siblings. And we found photos of my great-great-grandmother that had been passed down through one of his sister's families that we would never have seen if I hadn't been very, very persistent in tracking the family sideways. These things are out there, and there may be people, there may be somebody that photograph or that document is really meaningful to, but you have no direct connection to them because it's quite a maze to get to them, to find them through the traces back up the tree and down again. So I don't know how we might resolve that, but just because you have nobody to pass something to doesn't mean to say that there isn't somebody who is distantly related to you who would be very, very glad to receive that. How you find them, I don't know, without doing a lot of work, but they could be out there.
Cool. We'll all send them to you, Jane, and you can do the work.
Not the figurines, please.
Becca is next up for a comment.
Yeah, it's kind of following on actually from what Jane was saying. From my perspective with my autograph books, part of what I've been doing is trying to find a bit more about the owners, the nurses of these books. So I've been, going into the genealogy sites and doing a little bit of search around to see what family trees, to get a bit more background. And in doing so, I've come across obviously people's family trees that mention some connection to these people. And when I've contacted them, they don't always get back, but the ones who have got back to me, they weren't aware of the autograph books. They've been fascinated about them. They possibly knew that their ancestor was a nurse, but this book has gone from the family possession into an archive, and possibly because it landed up with somebody who had no children. And what do you do with these objects? So, it's been passed into archives like the, Museum of Military Medicine in this case. And I mean, so it's quite nice to make that circle whole again. You can't give these articles back because of the archives. I mean, they would have to approach them. But it's nice to sort of feel that they're learning something about their family they didn't know existed on this collection. And sometimes with the autograph books, they're often passed on because there's not a great deal in these books about the family, just who owned it, and it's a collection of soldiers' ditties in many, many ways. From my own personal experience, like a few other people on here, I have no children. I have a lovely family album and a war album. I've contacted my local heritage museum, and they're very interested, because we're a big local family, very interested in me leaving that album to them. Objects, I appreciate that's hard. What do you do with the candlesticks or whatever? The other album, the war album, I'm leaving to the, or I'm going to donate to the Royal Naval Museum. And that was a bit harder because some of these places get so much stuff that people want to donate. There's duplication and they'll often turn it down. And as I said, what do you do when, you've exhausted all of those avenues and nobody wants to take this? And my concern is if I don't do something now about this, there's going to be a house clearance. It's going to end up, possibly going to the dump. And that concerns me, that we are going to lose such a lot of valuable information about people from very interesting times in our lives. And that's sad. That's what I wanted to say anyway. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for that. I'd just like to acknowledge we are at time now. So if you do need to go, thank you very much for coming. We've got 3 more people with their hands up. So I thought we could, I'm happy to stay around for another, 10 or 15 minutes. So I'll let them speak. But if you have to head off, then please don't feel guilty about it, because I know that we're running over. But the next up is Eloise. Oh, sorry, I'm pronouncing your name badly.
That's all right. It's Eloise. Yes, thank you everyone for such wonderful papers. I've been fascinated for some time now about the relationship between living memories and then material and written memories. And I think a number of people's experiences that they've shared today have really highlighted that. Alison, talking about, you are the last member of your family with living memories of, was it your cousin Doris? Apologies if I've forgotten the details. But what happens at that point when the last person with living memories is deciding what to do with the material memories, the objects that they have? And I wonder, what is the role of educating and instilling a sense of value in the next generation who doesn't have living memories but need to make some sort of connection with the material ones if they are to preserve them. And I think, Lucy's experience is then a different one again, because as, has never having met her grandfather yet, has these documents and other objects and wanting to find out more and wanting to understand them. And yes, this is turning into a bit of a rambling comment, and I can't remember exactly what I was going to say, but yes, I do wonder, what is the relationship there, and at what point does the living memories outweigh the material objects and that sort of thing, and what is the pool that makes sure they're preserved? Some general thoughts there.
Thank you. Next up is Louise.
Hi there, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. My comment was just, I come from a photographic background, and that is a really rich area for kind of repurposing, reusing found images, family archives. There's so many artists working with this material. It's yeah, I just wanted to add that as you know, what we do with these items. But yeah, there's a lot going on and in that area.
Yeah, and websites and things that are dedicated to it, which is quite interesting as well. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
Helen, you get the final question or comment.
Right, I'll try and be brief because I think the sort of dual theme here for me was people are feeling a sort of sense of wanting to pass things on and preserve, and the kind of obligation side of it as well. And I think it's quite interesting in that you know, we kind of see these things generally as select survivals, but people also have to deal with kind of hoarders, frankly, when you're dealing with a, you know, house clearance and families who've, or individuals who just kept lots and lots. And I think there is that sort of, what's the limit to obligation there? You just have to kind of work through. I think you have to protect yourself a bit sometimes, and not kind of accept responsibility just because it's been slightly dumped on you. You know, just a slightly different perspective on it.
Yeah, that's also a nice way to kind of sum those things up, that yeah, we've been talking about all those emotional connections, but yeah, when do they go too far and where should we put our limits? Did any of our speakers have any final comments before we round up? I know we kind of went into a general discussion, but you might have had anything you wanted to add. Alison?
I was just going to say thank you to Helen, because she's actually summed up that sort of sense of obligation. And I think when it's a physical thing or something that's actually left to you in a will, it does put an even greater level of obligation on top of it. And I think from my own point of view, even these suitcases, I am looking at them and thinking, should I sort them? My grandmother was one of 5 children, and I've got a lot of second cousins on the Abercrombie side. And I think I might go through the suitcase and sort out some of the stuff that relates to the Abercrombies and send it to my cousins. That's maybe passing on the problem, but I think Helen actually summed that up very well. It's that sense of obligation. And it also, I think having done so much research in an archive, part of me is looking at this and thinking, God, someone in the future might want to write a PhD about this. I don't know, but that's another thing, another level altogether. But thank you, Helen. That was a really good comment.
Lucy as well.
I was just going to say that one of the things that does get missed out of these, not this discussion, but a lot of discussions like this, is that I think the mental health of the living, and as a historian I'm saying this, but the mental health of the living has to be seen somewhere. And if people are holding on to documents that are distressing for them, or that are going to make connections that they don't want to be made, I think you've got every right to get rid of them. And I know that's probably a very heretical thing to say, but it's what I believe. I've said in the chat, I do some part-time work as a marriage registrar, and when you're working on a marriage, one of the questions that you have to ask people for, and you have to ask them legally, is about their parents' details. And they can tell you beforehand that they're estranged, they don't want you to ask them, but on the day you actually do have to ask them. And the number of people who've got family estrangements is a lot bigger than we as a society actually really want to acknowledge. So I'm just throwing that out there.
Yeah, that's a good point. Cool. Any other final? Yeah, John. I think you need to unmute.
Yeah, I'd like to thank everyone who's made some comments. In particular, very naive, because my field is not genealogy and family histories. Lucy first mentioned the possibility of going to a war museum, and that never crossed my mind. So I'm sure there must be something like that in Japan. There would be local archives that might be interested in the material. Say I can't locate the family. Also, Jane's comment that there may well be family members out there who are desperate to learn more about their family. That sort of encouraged me to think, well, you know, somebody might my sense is, judging from the photographs that I have, is that the boy Jiro was the only son. There are no other siblings mentioned and no other photos. So that direct line may have ended, but there may be other people out there. The one thing that I haven't heard mentioned that I just want to throw out, it just sort of dawned on me. We're talking about these material objects and they take up space and they could deteriorate, and where do we donate them? But in the age of scanning and digitalization, has anyone explored this? Say I digitalize these photographs or some of these letters, that's another way of preserving. And then are there some archives perhaps, or places that would like that material? It would take me a few days, I think, to scan all the stuff I have, but it might be something.
And there's also, I think, as Jane suggested, websites that if you found something, you can scan it and put it up, and then hopefully it will find its owner, and that's quite interesting as well. I don't know if there's a Japanese equivalent of that, but there may well be. So to connect families with their objects.
Just in terms of preserving it as well, you might want to scan it and use the scans rather than handling the actual objects. If they become valuable, then that's something to think about.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I think that's everybody now. That was a really wonderful discussion, really wonderful papers with such raising lots of really fascinating questions. We didn't quite answer the one on the ethics, I think, either, but I thought that was really enjoyable. I did enjoy it, and so I'd like to thank our speakers for some really great papers. And I'd like to thank our audience for some really wonderful comments and for engaging so fully, I think, today. But I think that should be us. For me, it's bedtime. And for the rest of you in the UK, I hope you'll have a wonderful day. We'll see you all at our next session, which is next week. So thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks so much.